Two Geek Soup, and I'm John Vinalas, and once again with me is our good friend Aaron Welty.
Hey everybody!
All right, so today we're going to talk about Across the Spider-Verse. I'm super stoked for this. We haven't had anything this timely since we did Endgame, and so this is going to be fun. Hopefully, it will inspire more people to actually listen, because I got to tell you guys, as I mentioned when I started this back up here with Reed a few months ago, I really need to see good engagement and good numbers, to make me feel like this is something that's important to keep doing. And so far the downloads are not super encouraging. So I mean, I have had nice interactions with folks who have come to the show since I started it back up. And I know that there are some individuals who are very, faithful listeners. But I really need to see, like some more reviews popping up on the Apple Podcasts. People like retweeting and sharing the episodes on Facebook and stuff like that. Because otherwise, again, like I said with Reed, like there's other Christian geek stuff out there, and if nothing else, like I could leave the Discord channel open and maybe we grow the community a little bit that way, and that doesn't cost me anything. But having this hosted does, and if folks are ambivalent about listening, then I don't need to keep paying for that. So anyway, please do all the. It feels gross to say, like subscribe, share, rate, and review, but like it's important. So definitely do that. Aaron, I went back before we did this, before we started recording here today, and actually listened to our episode about Into the Spider-Verse, and we started that conversation off talking about Aquaman.
We did. I do recall that, because I actually went back and listened to the episode myself.
Right. So I in the intervening 4 years here, I have managed to see Aquaman, and I do say managed advisedly, because the first time I tried to watch it, I was bored out of my mind. I turned it off because I could not make myself care enough to keep watching it, and Beth finished it later. And I was just like, okay, so was his mom there at the end? Because I knew that was going to happen. He was like, okay, and did this and this happen? I was like, all right, that's fine. That's pretty much what I thought. Like, it definitely left me pretty cold. And it was actually not very long ago. It was just a few months ago that I ended up watching the rest of it. But I mean, I agree with your analysis at the time that it is still definitely better than a lot of what the DCEU had to offer at that time. Mm-hmm. I forget, had Justice League hadn't come out yet, because that was 2020, right?
Well, so the Snyder version of Justice League had not come out yet, but what has been affectionately dubbed as the Justice League, the bad version of it that they got in theaters, that was, I want to say, 2017, 2018-ish.
Oh, okay.
Something around there. But yeah, the multi-part, Zack Snyder's Justice League came out in 2020, which was was a lot better than what
it was.
Before.
It was better. I watched that recently too. I actually, I was shopping on Black Friday, and the DVD was on sale for like $5, so I went ahead and picked it up. I don't know. The weird thing about my copy of that is it's in 4:3. aspect ratio. Like it isn't widescreen.
So I think that might be because the the Zack Snyder version was specifically shot for IMAX.
Huh. Okay.
So that might be why. Because I think even when I watched it on HBO Max at the time, and I think having watched it since then, because I think I got like the 4K for like $10 or something.
Yeah.
I've noticed that yes, it's in a aspect ratio that you wouldn't expect, but I think that's mainly because of the fact that it was specially shot for IMAX presentation.
That's so bizarre because like it was known that it was going to HBO Max and it wasn't going to get a wide theatrical release, let alone be at a bunch of IMAX screens. But okay,
I
whatever.
Don't know.
Anyway,
I don't know.
no, like the best thing, sort of and I think I mentioned this on one of our other episodes. Like the highest praise that I can give the Snyder cut is that it made me want to go back and watch the director's cut of Batman versus Superman.
Yes. Yes, I mean the director's cut of Batman versus Superman is far superior to what we got in theaters, and I know.
I mean, it could almost not help
what we got in
but
theaters,
be better.
So.
Yeah, it would almost have to be better than what we got initially. But anyway.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. It's funny that the questions that you had asked, right? That you had asked Beth after she finished it about, was his mom there at the end and all that? Because I think at the time when it came out, and you and I were talking about it, without getting too spoilery at the time, I said that there was some commonality and common elements with Ant-Man and the Wasp, and one of those things being
right, with Janet,
the storyline of the mother.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, when I was listening to that and I heard you say that, I was like, huh, what was he talking about? But yeah, that's true. I am looking forward. I'm probably gonna go see the Flash movie. All of the nonsense with Ezra Miller notwithstanding, the chance to see Michael Keaton as Batman again on the big screen is something that I'm probably not going to be able to pass up.
I would agree with that. I mean, between that and for me, having read the Flashpoint,
right.
story in the comics, right? Having watched Flashpoint Paradox, having gone through this season of the Flash TV show with Grant Gustin, where they attempted to adapt elements of Flashpoint. I'm really interested to see how that story that I've engaged with multiple times already translates to a big screen film.
Yeah, I forget. So there was something that we were talking about with in our conversation about Into the Spider-Verse. I can't believe I didn't bring it up. Or maybe I feel like I had seen it already. We were talking about how Kingpin's motivation in Into the Spider-Verse was to bring his wife and son, from some other dimension into his own, and I can't believe I didn't bring up Fringe. In that. Because that's basically the same. That's basically the same story, and Fringe is amazing. If any of you have not watched Fringe, it is worthwhile. It is a great show. And
it definitely starts out as one thing, and then by the time you get to the end of the series, it's kind of becomes something else. And
it's very much a different thing. And it basically, Well, I mean, I don't want to say anything more than that about it.
Right.
It is worthwhile.
That it seemed to find a way to reinvent itself every few seasons.
Yeah.
And I will say,
in some ways, more extreme than others, but
right. Yeah. And if you are, I think I can say this safely without being too spoilery about the show. If you're a fan of X-Files, you'll enjoy it. If you're a fan of certain stories by Philip K. Dick, you will definitely enjoy some of the
Sure.
later seasons.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, let's get into this current movie, because there is just there is so much to say. you
There's a
know,
lot to say.
when when I left the theater, like, I have not had an experience of a film that just left me awestruck the way that this one did. And I tweeted right after I left the theater, like, Into the Spider-Verse is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. Not movies, things. Like, out of all things, like, Into the Spider-Verse is an absolutely astonishing piece of art. Like, there were so many moments that where it would linger on just an incredible shot, and it just took my breath away, like, many times throughout the movie. Like, that first good sequence that we get of Gwen walking, like, when she leaves the wherever the place is that they're practicing, like,
Oh yeah.
her skin and her hair, and, like, oh man, like, the
Like
way
the
that it plays with color, and and just, there are a lot of really bold artistic choices that were made with this film, and it veers pretty hard into the abstract sometimes.
it
but
does. And
it's
what's interesting
so
is
strong.
you're talking about this film as a whole essentially as an incredible piece of high art, and it's interesting that you say that, considering some of the discussion about art that happens during one of the
Yeah.
first fight sequences in the film in the museum.
Yeah, like, and that, honestly, like, that conversation about art in the museum is, like, the most lowbrow version, or like, it's the most lowbrow engagement with the concept of art that you could almost possibly have, in the context of talking about this movie. Like the things that they say are pretty, like, pedestrian and trite, and this film is
Well, maybe that's part of an intentional contrast, right? Because a lot of what gets talked about in that conversation in the museum about art, a lot of it comes from the primary antagonist in the scene, who is constructed in a very crude form, as opposed to the other characters in the scene that the antagonist is interacting with. I don't want to get too spoilery in terms of who that is.
I mean, it's in the first 10 minutes of the movie. I'm not too super worried about, like, we're not gonna be able to have the conversation we want to have here without getting into spoilers.
Yeah.
So
So
here it is. This is your spoiler alert, everybody. We are gonna spoil everything. So if you haven't seen the movie, I beg you, go see the movie, because even if you're somehow listening to this and you don't like Spider-Man, then I don't know why you're here. I'm glad you are. But even if you actively dislike Spider-Man, like, go and see this movie and, like, just try to turn that part of your brain off for a minute that doesn't like Spider-Man, and allow yourself to appreciate the incredible artistry of this film, because it is genuinely, like, to call it life-altering might be a little bit strong, but it's not very too much strong, because unless you are really steeped in in like high artistic stuff and like experimental cinema and everything, like I'm can pretty confidently say that this is gonna be a film experience probably like nothing you've ever had before.
And I would add to that, John, you had said go see this even if you're not a Spider-Man fan, right? I would say go see this even if you're not an animation fan,
Sure.
because there's a lot of folks who might miss out on this film and they might, write it off because, oh, it's animation. That's
Yeah.
for kids. You get that kind of attitude towards, say, Avatar The Last Airbender, or say
Mm-hmm.
even, Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels and The Bad Batch and things like that.
Yeah.
And like, I get where that comes from. I vehemently disagree with it, but I get where that comes from. But this is one of those instances where if you let that kind of bias kind of continue to permeate and you miss out on an opportunity like this just to engage the art form, not just in terms of cinema, but in terms of imagination and in terms of good story, like even outside of the fact that these are superhero characters and supervillains that we're dealing with, like you're really going to miss a story that is worthwhile engaging with in our culture.
Hmm. Yeah, for real. Yeah. Yeah, like, and that's, I feel like we've said things like this, on the show pretty frequently, that like the ability to engage a thing on its own terms is something that needs to be strengthened in a lot of people.
Yes.
And
I mean, and the thing about, I mean, we could just use this, movie as an example and kind of dig into this for ourselves. But when you watch a movie, when you watch a TV show, when
Mhm.
you read a comic book,
Yeah.
when you, read a novel or a nonfiction book, or even when you watch the news,
Mm-hmm.
you're not just, it's not just the thing that you think it is, because that thing, it has a worldview that is being expressed,
Yeah.
right? It has ideas that it's trying to intentionally put in front of you, to teach you, to say something to you,
Mm-hmm.
and you may not agree with what is presented to you and put in front of you, and then they're trying to tell you or teach you, but they are trying to say something. So are you
Yeah.
willing to engage with a thing on its own terms? And are you willing to engage with what they're trying to say? Are you willing to ask questions of what's in front of you and ask questions of what they're trying to say? Are you willing to allow it to ask questions of you?
Yeah.
And I think that kind of engagement is relatively healthy, in most cases.
Sure.
But we, unfortunately, we live in a culture right now where that happens less and less. And like you said,
Yeah.
engaging with a thing on its own terms is something that, as a wider culture, we need to be better at doing.
Like if you can manage to, even if you hate everything about comic book movies and the things that are fantastic and everything, and you can just manage to appreciate this thing on its own terms purely for its aesthetic value, I think you'll be the richer for it. I actually called my dad, and if you've listened to the show much, you've probably heard me talk a little bit about my dad and how he has no time for the fantastic and the speculative fiction and anything, and superheroes are just a great big giant eye roll to him. And I told him, listen, like this is a really special experience, and And even you, even you should be able to appreciate this on an artistic level.
So let me ask you this, John, because you're getting to something that I think is interesting. I remember back 15 years ago this summer, right? July of 2008, when The Dark Knight premiered, right?
Yeah.
Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale Batman movie with Heath Ledger as the Joker. And that film is a film that a lot of folks, I would say probably myself included, might be willing to argue that at the time that was a superhero film that transcended its genre and was something more than it purported to be on the surface. Not
Sure.
all superhero films do this. Not all superhero films are capable of this, but there were folks that said that The Dark Knight was one that was able to do that. Do you think that this qualifies in the same way?
Oh, easily. Like this transcends so many things. Like this transcends.
You want to deep dive that a little bit?
I'm sorry, what was that? Do I want to do what?
Do you want to deep dive that a little bit?
Like, honestly, like I don't know that I am equipped to do a good job of articulating the way that this transcends its genre, just because I'm not enough of an art person to do that. I feel like I know just enough to be dangerous in a conversation about art. But like what this certainly does is, like, it's not just like, and we've talked about stuff like this a lot on the show too. Like, this isn't just a movie about, superheroes trying to save the universe, right? This is a movie about struggling to find your place in the world. Like, feeling as though you won't really be accepted if you allow the people who are close to you to really see who you are.
I definitely think that is a theme that runs through the film.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think part of what I was getting at with the Dark Knight comparison is because at the time, one of the things that got talked about in certain circles related to that film, it wasn't just a superhero film, but it was also a film about what we were dealing with, kind of geopolitically at the time, in terms of the war on terror and those kind of things, and surveillance and
sure
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so you see some of that. You see some of that kind of transcendence in terms of current culture in, say, Winter Soldier.
Yeah.
You may, maybe not as much as blatantly as it seems to pop up in The Dark Knight, but you do see some of it in some of the philosophical discussions that happen between, say, Steve Rogers and Nick Fury.
Right.
About this isn't freedom, this is fear.
Right. Yeah.
And so I'm thinking a little bit along those lines in terms of how this movie speaks to current culture, but I also think that you're right about, thematically, in terms of, there's definitely that theme about, kind of finding your place.
Yeah.
But at the same time, from a certain point of view, Spider-Man's kind of always been about that, in terms of kind of the duality between, Peter Parker's life as a superhero, as
Right.
Spider-Man, but also
Yeah.
his life as, a teenager, a college student, a grad student, and all that kind of stuff. So I
Right.
like how that idea is being moved forward into the current culture that we're living in, and
Yeah.
wrestling with that. And I think wrestling with it on a level that's a lot deeper than some of the other Spider-Man movies have done.
You know what's
Before.
really interesting to me about the themes present in this movie is that it's a Spider-Man movie that is actually like it's really not about power and responsibility.
Say more about that.
Well, like in most Spider-Man movies, like that's a theme that you can't get away from.
Yes.
Like it's the entire Spider-Man thing. Like that is what you do in a Spider-Man story is you talk about power and responsibility. And this story, like, maybe it's kind of there, but it's only really there to the same extent that it would be there in any superhero movie. Like it's kind of it's there sort of in a background, like assumption level way that you can always talk about any superhero movie being about, like, the hero using their abilities for good, and like that's a choice that they make because of who they are as a person. Like that's there. You can get it out of there, but like that's not a story element or a theme that this movie is particularly like presenting to us, right?
Right. And I think part of the reason for that is that when you look at the movie that came before this, right, when you look at Into the Spider-Verse, that is a theme that factors pretty heavily into the first film featuring Miles, almost to the point where they poke fun at it.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah. I mean, it's front and center in all of the recent Spider-Man, well, all of the Spider-Man movies that we have. Like they're
Right.
all about power and responsibility, and this is not, and that's super refreshing, and it's really great that at this point the writers of Spider-Man movies are confident enough in their audience that they to know that, okay, yes, this is part of who Peter Parker is, or who Spider-Man is, no matter who that character is. And so, but that's not all he is. There's more there than
Right.
just power and responsibility. And
So let me offer
that's great.
let me offer this, which I think is interesting, because when you watch, say, the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies,
Yeah.
like you don't get the origin that you expect to get that you get in all the others, because Uncle Ben doesn't feature at all.
Yeah, not explicitly, right? Yeah.
He's not explicitly, he's not there. So because we're so familiar with Spider-Man as a character, we just kind of assume that that's baked into the story somehow.
Right.
And the studio is taking advantage of that and saying, hey, we don't need to retread this. We don't need to retell this. And so you don't see it in the Tom Holland movies the way you expect to. But what I'm thinking about, and that's kind of been a hallmark for Sony Spider-Man films,
Mm-hmm.
In recent years. But what I'm also wondering now, as we're talking about this theme of, with great power comes great responsibility, or as Miles' dad says in the previous film, I think it's with great ability comes accountability or whatever, and they kind of put a different spin on it.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about now, considering a lot of what, say, the third act of this film kind of pivots on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know we'll get into it, but the fact that there's something that's supposed to happen, that has to happen.
We're I have
Right.
I have a whole album side about that part of the story. We're for sure gonna get into that.
So, because I wonder if, and so I'll save this for then when we actually get into that, because I think there might be an interesting connection to Star Wars there, believe it or not.
No way, you're gonna make a Star Wars analogy? Get out of here.
Right, me? I never do that.
Yeah. So before we get lost in the thematics of it too much, there are just a couple things. I usually like to try and bring some comics lore into stuff like this, but
Right.
we would be here for literal days, and
We would.
and like actually literally it would take hours and hours and hours to
just
even
just with the main three.
Well, with the main three, what I was gonna say is, to get into even just the people who are a little bit highlighted,
Right.
Scarlet Spider.
Oh man,
that's where
Ben Reilly.
Ben Reilly is where comic books continuity goes to have 8 Gordian knots all together, and
Right.
and it's that's a whole thing, and all of the variations of Spider-Man they're coming too fast for you to even be able to process it, and this is going to be a super fun one to get on DVD later, and sort of go frame by frame and pick out the things that are happening in the little caption boxes, because when he's first getting the tour of the Spider Society place,
Of the lobby?
in the and in the bigger concourse or whatever you want to call that larger space, you have labels on a bunch of these people, but you can't even see what they say, and that'll be fun to go into later. But
that level of visual density reminds me of watching and rewatching Ready Player One.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah. Yep.
And just the amount of visually, the amount of things, Easter egg and referentially, that Warner Brothers was able to pack into that film.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like that.
Yeah. Something we mentioned on the other episode was how each Spider character had their own kind of physicality. And that holds true here. The things that we saw in those characters are still present. But what's taken to a different level in this movie is the way that each character almost gets their own well, and it was kind of true in the other one as well. There were different artistic styles that were present, especially with Penny and with Spider-Ham, because she was very anime influenced, and Spider-Ham was very 2D cartoon,
Looney Tunes.
Yeah, sort of. That's just exactly what I was about to say. Sort of a Looney Tunes style going on with him. But
because I think there was the moment towards at the end of the first one where he makes that comment, that's all, folks, and somebody else is like, is he even allowed to say that? Legally,
right.
Is that okay?
Yeah. But with this one, that level of, or that aspect of artistic style is taken to a whole other level. And especially with the Hobie character.
Oh yeah.
Which was really interesting because when I heard him called Hobie, so I didn't know a lot about the Spider-Punk character, and I didn't realize how recent of a creation he was. His first appearance was in 2015.
Oh my gosh, that's a whole lot more recent than you would think, considering like his whole vibe is very like 70s, 80s, early 90s punk scene.
Yeah, well, I would say definitely more. Yeah, the early punk. In the 70s for sure. Yeah, and I knew that Hobie Brown was actually the name of the Prowler character in the 616.
Oh, okay, yep.
Yeah, and that character's story is vastly different from the Prowler, from the Aaron Davis version of Prowler.
Yeah, I'm far more familiar with the Aaron Davis version.
Right. Yeah, well, and because the 616 Prowler is pretty obscure, like he does not feature prominently in almost anything. He's very much a sort of a third or fourth tier kind of a Spider-Man background character. He was part of a team that was led by Silver Sable for a while, who is also sort of a third tier Spider-Man character.
who was supposed to get her own movie at one point.
Yeah. Silver Sable and Black Widow, or Black Cat, were supposed to have a movie together. But the way that like it's funny, like his visualization, it's very much not subtle.
No,
the way that he just sort of breaks the rules, like he like it's like the line work of his character like can't even contain him. He's literally like coloring outside the lines with the way that he's portrayed. That makes sense considering the influences, right? Like exactly,
punk has never been subtle.
Yeah, no. And so that's kind of fun. But that sort of that same kind of those same sorts of visual cues are present in other characters as well, and I am thinking particularly of Miguel.
Sure.
And the way that Miguel is visualized is in really stark, rigid angles.
Which
you can
fits his
see
personality in the film.
Exactly. Yeah. Like when you have like sort of a closer up shot of him, you get these lines that come off his shoulders, right, in sharp angles, and that's kind of cool.
Even the design of the suit in the film, and even in the original comics is kind of like that in terms of how the spider emblem is realized and those sorts of things. So like the fact that they were able to translate that in a way that also visually reflects not only his personality but his view of the world.
Well, and his vibe here is definitely not quite the same as what you would have seen in the comics. He was definitely a much darker kind of character than the mainstream Spider-Man, but you still got the same sort of like Spider-Man quippiness with him generally.
Okay.
And it was just a little bit darker, a little bit more violent, You know, his power set was definitely geared a little bit more toward you know, confrontation and combat. He did have like this weird, like, you know, poison bite ability that would like paralyze his enemies, and you know, his wall crawling is, you know, from these claws that he has, and not like sort of just your general, you know, sticky, sort of more innocuous like wall crawling ability that you would have seen, you know, in the main timeline Spider-Man. But
And that venom bite is something that I thought it was interesting. Like, he almost uses it in the movie.
yeah, yeah, like, you know, I was not ready for this to be a cliffhanger. I don't know if you knew that this was going to end that way. Like, I knew that another one was coming, you know, sooner rather than later, but I kind of just expected it to be, you know, the third installment in the trilogy. You know, I was what I was looking for in this movie was something that was going to set up an overarching conflict like you actually had in the Spider-Verse comic event with are you familiar with the Inheritors, Aaron?
I am not. Actually, that's something I've never heard of.
Okay, do you know how much Spider-Man have you actually read, like, in the last 20 years or so?
I read all of the original run of Ultimate Spider-Man from like 2002 to like 2009, 2010.
Okay, did you read the run that J. Michael Straczynski wrote on Amazing Spider-Man?
No, but I do like Straczynski.
Dude, Straczynski's run on Spider-Man is one of my favorite runs of Spider-Man ever. And he introduces this idea of Spider-Man gaining his power not just from, you know, radioactivity, like a mutated spider, but through this like totemic power of the spider, and that the spider was actually coming to bite him and give him the power before it was irradiated.
So are we talking like kind of like almost like an African mythology, like Anansi type thing?
Yes, exactly like that.
Okay, yeah, got it.
Yeah. So then once you have that, then you sort of introduce this whole like food chain a little bit. and there are these beings called the Inheritors that basically feed on this totemic power. And the first of these that he encounters is a guy named Morlun. And that's sort of the villain that pops up at the beginning of Straczynski's run. And it's really cool. So anyway, like you eventually find out there are more of these characters, and the whole Spider-Verse event in the comics was the Inheritors, like, not just hunting Spider-Man in our universe, but like seeking out these totemically empowered beings like throughout the multiverse. And so then they recruited different, you know, spider people from all sorts of timelines and universes to come and help fight that struggle. And so that was sort of the core concept that you saw in the first one that they brought from the comics. So what I was looking for in Across the Spider-Verse was something that would set up a larger conflict that would bring the Inheritors into it as well. And I was not ready for such a stark cliffhanger. And so that's going to be pretty interesting.
I think so a couple of thoughts. First, Moreland. That sounds interesting to me because it sounds a lot like Morden, who was one of the main antagonists in Babylon 5, which of course was also written by Straczynski, and Mr. Morden was heavily influenced as like a kind of a futuristic space manifestation of Morden from Arthurian legend. So I wonder if there's some of that influence there too, based on some of Straczynski's past work. Perhaps
Moreland is pretty different than the shadows from Babylon 5, but
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get into a little bit of the themes here a little bit more, because something that is so interesting in this movie, like, this is going to be a little bit like how I feel about Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. I think that it's gonna, the way that I feel about this movie is gonna depend on where it goes next.
Fair. I mean, having seen Multiverse of Madness multiple times, and having seen this at least twice, I can understand that.
Like, because I'm gonna go like 30 seconds on Multiverse of Madness, even though we'll do a whole podcast about it later. My main thesis of Multiverse of Madness is that if... No, I don't have time for that. We're not going to do that. Never mind.
Okay.
Cut that part out, because that's going to take too long, and that's not what we're here to talk about. Okay. But what's going on in this movie that is going to... My feelings on it are going to be so shaped by what comes next, because, you know, there is... The conflict in this movie is like destiny versus what I think is right.
I think that is a great way to have encapsulated the primary. I was trying to think of a better word than conflict, but yeah, that.
Because I feel like it's going to be interesting to see how they land it.
Right.
Because, you know, it's presented in terms that are going to be a little bit that they're going to cause us as people of faith and people who believe in God and to a greater or lesser extent the sovereignty of God, in terms that are going to cause us to give their articulation of this stuff some side eye. You know, especially, you know, starting with the language that they use of the canon, and
right.
And so, you know, obviously that term has a different connotation in the comic book realm, because we talk about something being canon or not canon,
yes.
and basically all that means is, does it count for the purpose of like understanding who this character is and what they have actually accomplished. Or is it just kind of a side story that, you know, if it happened, if it didn't happen, it doesn't really matter.
Is it a what if? Is it an Elseworlds? You know.
Yeah.
You know, is it mainline or not?
Right.
Like you said, does it count?
Yeah. And so, but the way that that concept is fleshed out in this movie, starts to veer into the conception of canon that we as Christians are more familiar with when we talk about the canon of Scripture, and the way that we think it's really important that it be recognized that what we see in the Bible is divinely inspired, and
Right.
and everything that is there is supposed to be there, and nothing that is not there should be included. And
Right.
and there's a fundamentalism that's present in Miguel and the people who are on his side in this conflict that resonates to me sort of with that same kind of frequency, you know.
So
because they talk about when they're talking to Miles about why things are happening the way that they're happening, these things smack to me of the same kind of trite and not sufficiently robust kinds of things that some Christians say to the same sorts of questions. You know, this is just the way things are. This is just the way it works. Like, I don't have any answer for your question other than the Bible says so. And even with Gwen's dad, you know, the response that he tries to give her is, I taught you to do things by the book.
Yes.
And so yeah, I feel like we're teeing up for a resolution to this story where we have misunderstood what the web of interconnectedness really means, and that it doesn't have to be this thing that we hold on tightly to and try to enforce, you know, boundaries upon it, but that there's more to it than what we think, and you know, to have these, you know, these canon events, which, right, by the way, just sort of a fun little nerdy part of this, you know, the death of Captain Stacy and whatever other captain is labeled as ASM 90, and Amazing Spider-Man issue number 90 is the one where Captain Stacy dies.
Okay.
So anyway,
you know what?
That was just a fun little aside.
Well, so what I like about a lot of things here. What I like about that little bit is that, if I remember correctly, in Amazing Spider-Man 2, when Gwen dies, the clock stops. I want to say at like issue 1, at like 120, as a way to nod to the issue that she actually died in the comics.
Oh,
so,
interesting.
Like, I dig that. So I came at this at a little more of a fandom perspective, to be honest.
Okay.
Right? Like, so I've come to call kind of this meta narrative that we're talking about. I've come to call this, like, and it just came to me today, I've come to refer to it as the web of canonicity.
Okay.
right? Because you think about how it's displayed visually on the screen and whatnot. So, but the thing I kept thinking about, especially the first time I saw it and seeing it again reinforce this is the comic book version of quote unquote fixed points in time from Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Right? These things are inalterable.
Yeah.
Like I think about like it's not a meme, but it's like this thing online that you can look up where, various comic book characters are having like iMessage conversations, right? And they're always kind of funny. And there's this one between like Superman and Doctor Who and a couple other DC characters or whatever, and they're talking about, well, can't you just, take your blue police box and go back in time and prevent the destruction of Krypton? And the doctor says, sorry, that's a fixed point in time.
Right.
And so part of the way I came at this from a fandom perspective was these things, and it isn't just Spider-Man, it's other characters too. These kinds of things happen in these stories.
Right.
And it's mostly tragedy.
Yeah.
Because if these things don't happen, it's not just, they talk about it in terms of the movie, in terms of these universes being in danger. It's that these characters that we know don't become who they need to become without these things actually occurring. Like, I mean,
right.
Spider-Man doesn't become who he's supposed to become. Superman doesn't. Batman doesn't. Green Lantern doesn't. Flash doesn't.
Right.
Yeah,
because all of these heroes are born out of adversity.
They're born out of adversity. They're born out of tragedy.
Yeah.
And grief.
Who was
and
I
loss.
hearing? Who was I hearing talk about this? I feel like I heard this. Like, you don't get bravery without danger. You
don't.
Like it doesn't take a hero to to make some toast. Like you don't get bravery unless you have a situation that demands courage.
Right. I mean, it's like, I always, one of the places I always go back to is Paul in Romans 5, where he talks about rejoicing in suffering, because suffering produces perseverance, perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope, and it's a progression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but it's a progression that you cannot reverse engineer. It's like it's a one-way street.
Huh.
Right? And it's a one-way street, and if you don't go through all of the points in the progression, like you have to go through all of them, and if you don't go through all of them, you're not going to get where you're supposed to go. And so like there's that perspective that I came at this from. But what I also thought was interesting is, so this both of these movies are to some degree written, produced, and or directed by Miller and Lord, right? Who did the Lego movies.
Yeah.
Who also at one point were co-directing the Solo movie before they got fired, and they brought in Ron Howard.
Right.
Right. So I wonder if some of this fundamental piece that you see in Miguel when he's talking about the dangers of breaking canon, I wonder if some of that is Miller and Lord's way of and say, Sony's way of saying, here is what Disney has done with different franchises with some of the choices that they've made that fans have been less than happy about. And, I don't know this for sure, but maybe some of that is their kind of meta-narrative way of pointing other places and saying, here's where you made some choices that ended up being mistakes, where things that people have come to understand as canon for, say, Star Wars post Return of the Jedi, They
Yeah.
grew up with this quote-unquote Lucas-approved canon, and you made a choice to get rid of all that and to replace it with some things that fandom likes, some things that fandom does not like. And
and some things that different segments of fandom are sharply divided over. Some
also
of them
correct.
because I'm one of those guys that thinks The Last Jedi was a fantastic movie. And
there are folks that disagree with that.
Yeah. And I also am one of these weird ones that I also don't hate Rise of Skywalker.
Right. I'm one of the ones where like I don't love The Last Jedi. I don't hate it. I don't love Rise of Skywalker. I don't hate it. I'm familiar enough, and I think you and I both are familiar enough with the old canon that we can look at those films and we can say, well, this came from this, and this came from this, and this came from this. We might not like how it all got put together, but we can see behind the scenes where they pulled things from. And so, since we're talking about this web of canonicity, right, and I'm linking it to kind of looking at it through a fandom lens and talked about Star Wars. Earlier when I was talking about the idea of power and, with great power and great responsibility and stuff, and how we talked about how, okay, this isn't necessarily at the forefront of the film, but it's there. I wonder if one of the ways it's there is in this web that we're talking about, where you get to that point in the film, Miles realizes he's faced with a choice, and he attempts to fulfill what he believes to be the correct resolution of that choice, because he figures out that his father is now in danger and he doesn't want to let his father die. And so he goes against everything that Miguel has tried to tell him, and essentially makes an enemy or an antagonist of Miguel, and attempts to stop and alter this supposed canon event. And when I think about that as it relates to some wars, in the 4th season of Rebels, there's a moment where a main character in Rebels, Ezra Bridger, he's encountered this space, referred to as the world between worlds.
Yeah.
Influenced at least in part, Dave Filoni has admitted, influenced at least in part by the wood between the worlds from Magician's Nephew from Chronicles of Narnia.
Oh, cool! I didn't know that.
And he got asked that question, and I think at Star Wars Celebration 2019 at a Rebels panel, and his response to it was simply, "Well, my wife is really well read, and we talk about this kind of stuff a lot." So it's Filoni's non-answer answer that he is famous for.
Yeah.
But when you think about the world between the worlds, right, and Ezra realizes as he's in there with Ahsoka what's going on and what he can do and how he can step in and alter certain points in time because of where he's at, and he wrestles with and struggles with, do I use this place that I'm at as a way to save Kanan?
Yeah.
But if I attempt to save Kanan, what happens? And thanks to Ahsoka, he gets to the point where he realizes, okay, I have to make the hard choice and not do what I want and still let Kanan die. And that is essentially the choice that Miles is faced with at the end, towards the end of this film, and he has chosen other than what Ezra chose. And then, of course, in the 3rd film, we'll hopefully see how that plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I feel like this movie is sophisticated enough that it can't, like, the answer can't just be follow your heart.
Yes.
Like, it can't just be, well, I know this is the right thing to do, and so that's what I'm going to do. we ended up talking a lot in the conversation about the last movie about what it means to be part of the body of Christ. And
we did.
And I hope that this also lands in a place that is going to provoke more conversation like that, because we can't let's go ahead and keep the the canon language going here. Like, we can't really understand what Scripture is and what it means in isolation. Even the greatest biblical scholars of our time will say, if they're asked a question that's outside of their expertise, if they're when they're humble, and I'm thinking here especially of N.T. Wright. When he's asked stuff about the Old Testament, he is very quick to say, I study Paul. I'm really into the early church and the 1st and 2nd century, and I can't give really detailed analysis of what is in the Old Testament. Now, of course, a guy like N.T. Wright has already forgotten more about the Old Testament than either of us ever knew. But he what I'm getting at here is that we need each other, and we need the body to work through this together, because everybody is going to bring a perspective. Everybody has a little bit of the puzzle, and so I kind of hope that where we get to is that that Miles comes to a place where he is accepted, and he does demonstrate that he has something important to offer, and also he realizes that he can't just do his own thing,
right,
and that he needs the guidance and the wisdom of the community that's around him. So, yeah.
To keep the language going from the movie itself, he needs essentially the band that Gwen has formed to try to go find him.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what happens right there at the end. And I think you're right. If this trilogy and the questions that it is presenting and the ideas that it is presenting and the questions that it's asking, if this ends simplistically, then it will ultimately have done itself, the material, and the audience a disservice. This needs to be more of a nuanced, poignant resolution that causes you to really sit down and think and ponder and ask some of those questions that you and I were asking at the end of the first one, especially with what Kingpin tries to do, was that if that was us, right, if we were in those places and spaces and having to make those decisions, what would we decide? Because one of the things that's very, very obvious about the first movie and also this one, even through Miguel and how he explains kind of his story and his origin, how he got to where he is the idea that, and some of this I got from listening to a convocation at Liberty years ago that Donald Miller did when he was talking about the nature of story and story structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the idea that a hero and a villain, or a victor and a villain, right? They both, those characters in the story, the protagonist, the antagonist, the victor and the villain, they both start out the same.
Okay.
They start out as victims in some way. Right? They have experienced grief or loss or pain or have been wounded in some way, and their story and who and what they become turns on this question of what do they do with their pain?
Yeah.
How do they use their pain? You know, you've got great examples like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader and that kind of thing, and the fact that a hero is going to take their pain, take their grief, take their difficulty, and a hero is going to use that to help others heal and to help others make good choices. Whereas a villain is going to weaponize their wounds to create more victims like themselves.
Right.
Like, you know, some of that language is in me, some of it's Donald Miller. Like, and I always one of the not so great examples that I always go back to is, you know, James Kirk in Star Trek V. Right, I need my pain.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well that's what you don't want to do.
Right.
Even though, you know, Jim Kirk's not necessarily a villain.
No,
sometimes,
but it's
you know, sometimes even heroes get it wrong.
Yeah, it's a dodgy idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of in a place with this film where we're engaging with these ideas around heroes and villains and the fact that, like, Miles and Miguel, they've both experienced pain.
Yeah.
But they haven't necessarily both done the same thing with it.
Right.
And, you know, from a certain point of view, Miguel has been more accepting of the reality that he's been in, because kind of like, you know, Miguel did a thing that's kind of like Flash and kind of like Flashpoint.
Right.
And tried to inhabit a life that wasn't necessarily his own and his to inhabit, and it caused problems. And he's learned from that. Whereas Miles isn't at that place yet. He isn't at that point yet. He's going to try to prevent this thing that is quote unquote supposed to happen. And one of the big questions that the third movie is going to have to answer is, what are the effects and consequences of his choice depending on what he chooses?
Right.
And how is that going to affect the wider world? Because you've got a character like, you know, from Star Wars, like, say, Anakin Skywalker, right? He does the incorrect thing with his pain. He's selfish with his pain.
Yeah.
He makes, or, you know, not even present pain, but possible future pain that he doesn't want to experience.
Right.
He's selfish around those things, and this decision that he makes in his own selfishness leads him on a path that ends up enslaving the galaxy for a generation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that we have reason to be hopeful, because I'm struggling to see how the team that has given us, you know, what we have in the two movies, you know, right now, are gonna end up in such a trite place, you know, with the third one. I'm hopeful.
I can agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's go ahead and start to bring this in for a landing, because we've been going for a while here. And
so
go ahead.
Before we wrap up, I do have a question for you, because one of the things we tend to do, or at least have done in the past with movies like this, I'm really curious to know kind of like what your favorite moment and or Easter egg in the film was.
There are so many. Like, this thing is just like a giant overstuffed basket of Easter eggs. And
it is.
One thing that I've really enjoyed is I liked having the sort of the branching timeline tree that we've
from
seen.
Loki?
Yeah, from Loki. I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
I loved having what's the name of that actor now? The guy from Community. who has
Yes, Donald Glover.
Yeah, I loved it that there was a live action Donald Glover in this movie as a Prowler variant. Like, that was super cool.
That was probably my favorite.
Yeah, that was really fun.
Well, because it raised a number of questions for me, right? Like, so, because we saw Aaron Davis in the first Tom Holland movie,
Right.
right? As we saw, Aaron Davis as played by Donald Glover,
Yes.
in the which led us to believe, okay, he's going to become Prowler at some point, which means Miles is out there in the MCU at some point, but he's not that Spider-Man yet.
Right.
Like, so is that Prowler that we saw possibly the same Aaron Davis that we saw in the Tom Holland films? Probably not.
Yeah, probably
but
not.
Maybe.
Probably not.
And when you think about how Donald Glover as that character in Community in that Spider-Man onesie was one of the main influences to create Miles Morales in the first place. I mean, this is definitely a, the circle is now complete kind of moment.
Miles existed before that.
Really? I was under the impression that it was that that episode.
No, that did not create Miles, but that was a push for there to be a movie about Miles with Donald Glover as the starring Donald Glover. There was a push for that, but Miles already existed before that. Yeah.
Miles as a character was already in existence from Brian Michael Bendis prior to Community being a show?
I really believe that's the case, but let's make sure about that.
Because I was always under the impression that the two main influences for the creation of Miles Morales was Donald Glover in the onesie in that episode of Community, and then Barack Obama being president at the time.
Yeah, no, his first appearance was in August of 2011. So Community definitely comes a good bit after that.
Okay.
Gee. Well, so there is overlap here. Community ran from 2009 to 2015. So
yep, the 6 seasons, right?
Yeah, that's right. 6 seasons and not yet a movie.
And almost a movie.
Oh, right, because it was in production at some point, wasn't it?
It's actually, I think they've slowed things down because of the writer's strike that's going on right now, but they are moving, up until the writer's strike, they had been moving forward with plans to do the movie, and hopefully if the writer's strike resolves itself at some point here, they'll continue production.
Yeah. Okay, hang on a second, because I'm gonna look, and we're gonna find out. We're gonna find out about this because let's see, publication history. It did have to do with Obama being president, yes. Oh, you are right, Aaron. Because the way he looked in his first appearance were heavily influenced by African-American actor Donald Glover's appearance as Spider-Man pajamas in Anthropology 101. You are correct. I was wrong. All right, there you go.
That's okay, man.
Very interesting. Okay. All right. Okay. So anyway,
I think that's a large part of why he has popped up.
Yeah.
So much in terms of, either in other media either. I think in one cartoon he actually voiced Miles.
Yes, that's true. Yes, in the Ultimate
And
Spider-Man
then
cartoon, he was the voice
right,
of
yep.
Miles. Yeah.
And then of course where we've seen him in live action and places related to Spider-Man. So.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's go ahead and unless you have anything else that you want to particularly bring out, we should probably start to bring this in for a landing.
Not really. I really wanted to make sure that we
Yeah.
talked about around the web of canonicity and all of that stuff.
You know, one other thing that I want to say real quick about the style of this movie is how things, the way it's animated, like stuff shifts around a lot, and like the lines aren't always really firm. But one thing that always stays like solid and in place are the characters' eyes.
Okay.
And
say more about that.
Oh no, it was just I just think it's cool that like that's just sort of a place in the characters where they're like grounded and like and stable, and it's a place for you as a watcher to kind of continue to connect with them, So like the eyes are always sharply defined, even if the rest of the character is mutable.
I wonder if some of that might have to do with the idea that the eyes are the window to the soul.
Yeah.
And the fact that
that's sure. I mean why not? Something that's interesting is that the Rio character on Earth 42 has green eyes instead of brown eyes. If you're watching carefully, you can see that, and it looks like I was trying to look carefully at Miles 42, and it looks like his eyes are a little bit greener than our Miles are as well. So anyway, that's just sort of
okay. So you're talking about at the end.
Yeah.
The one thing I will mention, and I definitely felt this the first time I watched the film, having read pretty much the entire original run of Spider-Gwen that went for 50, 60 issues or whatever it was, and recently began to reread pieces of that, reading about her origin and the death of her Peter Parker. Reading about it is one thing. Actually watching it happen in this film is totally something else. It's so much more like emotional and visceral, and as somebody who, obviously not the way Peter died, but as somebody who has lost friends very close to me in say the last decade or so, like I felt that scene very, very deeply, and was like, I did not, kind of like you did not expect this to be a cliffhanger ending, right, for the movie. I did not expect to feel that so hard. I mean, both times that I watched it in the last 3 or 4 days, but man, like seeing it play out on the screen is totally different than watching it in relatively static panels by comparison.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So one last little thing that I liked to see was Gwen saving Miles with a web.
Yes.
That was a really neat sort of inversion of the fate of Gwen from the comics. Yep. So anyway, yep. All right. Okay. So now we're gonna really, really be done. Third time's the charm. Let's do it now. And before we leave, we are gonna close with a piece of guaranteed good news. And in Kenya, there's a great big there's a huge tract of land called the Tsavo East National Park. And there's all sorts of wild animals in there, and it's not a place where you would want to be alone, especially as a 4-year-old boy. And little Ayub got lost in the Tsavo East National Park and was missing for 6 days in a territory 66% larger than Yellowstone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But thanks to the help of 2 Kenyan British pilots, they were able to find him and rescue him, and he was able to get home safely. So we'll post a link to that story in the show notes. There's more to it, and it's pretty harrowing, but turns out good, just like we hope the story of the Spider-Verse will. And so yeah, that's going to be it for us tonight. Again, please, like I said at the beginning, would really love to see some new reviews and ratings of the podcast on the Apple Podcast platform. The Discord is a great place to hang out. We have fun conversations there. Please come and be part of that. As a Patreon supporter, you'll have the opportunity to actually be in the audio room with us as we record here, and you can get the full uncut and unedited experience, and you'll hear all the stuff that wasn't good enough to be put into the podcast. I will mention again that there's a clue to a specific super nerdy thing that is encoded into the Patreon page, and if you are able to figure out what that is, that will get you the opportunity to enjoy the tier 3 benefits of the Patreon. And also, the first 4 people who support will have the opportunity to take part in a one-shot mini D&D campaign that I will run and that we will publish on the podcast as a real play episode. So Aaron,
that sounds like fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I hope we can pull it off. Fortunately, Aaron, it looks like you are not going to be furloughed from your job like you were the last time we did this.
Oh yeah.
And and so he's gonna keep making sure all the airplanes do what they're supposed to do, and we'll catch you next time. You can reach us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at 2GeekSoup. And even though it probably makes me the ill-prepared substitute teacher, this podcast is a proud member of the More Than One Lesson family.